I was in Transylvania in January to attend the celebrations for the 450th anniversary of the Edict of Torda. So I'm going to give an illustrated talk about that event and about that edict, and hopefully shed some light on the history of Unitarianism in Transylvania. Now, I have to apologize in advance for any Hungarian speakers who might be here for the murder I'm going to do to your language today, but I'll do my best, and please correct me whenever I go wrong. But I was there in January. The 13th of January is the anniversary of the promulgation of the edict, and I was pleased to be there. And it was a great occasion, so one of the things I want to talk about is the way it was celebrated. There were some interesting things there. Also, to me, there some things came to light which shed new light on the history of Unitarianism in Transylvania. Maybe not new to everyone, but they were new to me. And I think in the last 20 years, there's been far more opportunity for people from Britain to visit Transylvania, and there's been far more connection with the churches, and I think that a lot of that connection is very much appreciated. But it's important that we do maintain these connections and we think about the life of the churches and we interact with them. And this interaction really doesn't begin historically until the middle of the 19th century. Partly that's because there isn't really an organized Unitarian church in Britain until the 1820s maybe. There is in Transylvania from 1568, but there are no Unitarians here in an organized way until the early 19th century. And the first real connection is in 1821, when the Unitarian Fund sends a message in Latin to the Unitarian Church in Transylvania. And very slowly things start to happen from that. Prior to that, it's important to note, the main connection for Transylvanian Unitarians outside of Transylvania was with the Remonstrant Church in the Netherlands. From the middle of the 17th century onwards, right through the 18th century, Transylvanian students were sent to the Netherlands, to Remonstrant training colleges, particularly to Leiden and places like this. And this had a very strong influence on the direction of Unitarian theology in Transylvania. Later in the 19th century, there was a Protestant theological academy established in Vienna, which became important, and then German universities were used after that. And only later still did connections develop with Britain, and many students came first to Manchester College and then also to the Unitarian College in Manchester. And of course, connections also began with the United States. Now, the most important individual Unitarian with connections between Britain and Transylvania was John Paget, and there's an article about him by David Wykes in the Transactions in 1980. But he married a Hungarian countess and set up home in Transylvania and wrote a very important travelogue that had a lot of influence actually internationally and in terms of government policy following the 1848 revolution. He also translated the chapter in John Relly Beard's book, Unitarianism Considered in its Actual Condition. But what I want to do at the start, well, throughout the talk, is go through my experiences and look at them also in the light of some early 19th century Unitarian visitors to Transylvania. So here we have some of the first visitors from Britain to Transylvania. On the left is Lucy Taggart, who visited Transylvania with her father in 1858. And her father was Edward Taggart, who is minister in London. And this was really quite an important occasion. It was the first sort of physical connection being made, which led to a lot of students coming back to Britain. And they visited very soon after the 1848 revolution. And later on, Lucy Taggart wrote of the situation in 1858. The country still bled with unhealed wounds. On every side, the civil war between the Hungarian races and the Wallachs and Slovaks, incited by Austria and aided by Russia, had left evidences of ravages, buildings unrestored, homes destroyed, fields untilled, roads unmended, and the countenances of men were anxious and depressed. But the spirit of the Hungarians was still unsubdued. So you get a picture, just that snapshot from our first visit, of a really quite disrupted society. And unfortunately, that's one of the pictures you get periodically when you look at Transylvanian life and also at Unitarian life. But Lucy Taggart was with her father. Her father died at Brussels on the way back. So that sort of slowed down the connections. But the next year, the Reverend S.A. Steinhall, who was a minister in Liverpool, he was sent to try and pick up where the process had broken off. He was the son of a German immigrant and was, I think, fluent in German, which is why he was sent. But he was sent again. This is 11 years after the revolution. Times are difficult. They didn't really know he was coming officially, but they did know he was coming because as he crossed Hungary, the secret police were monitoring him, and the head of police went to the bishop's office to ask if this gentleman had arrived from England or not. So they had forewarning, because even in those days, the equivalent of the Securitate were watching. And on the end there is John James Taylor, who visited 10 years later, 1869, when he was principal of Manchester New College. Again, he actually got home, but he died within a year of getting home. He was quite elderly when he went. But I'll just quote something that he went in 1868, actually, again for the anniversary of the Edict of Torda. So he attended the 300th anniversary of the Edict of Torda. But Taylor wrote, "It is difficult to describe the singular impression produced by finding oneself among a people whose political sentiments and religious belief so closely resemble our own, but whose language is so entirely novel and strange. In spite of this difference of origin, the institutions and the manners of the Magyar race have remarkable similarity to those of England, and for England they entertain a reverential regard." So there was, for a lot of these early travellers, when they got there, they found a connection, they found a similarity and a sort of sense of kinship, particularly with the Unitarian Church in Transylvania. And Alexander Gordon, who went a little bit later, he said, "After the novelty of the situation was worn off, the uppermost feeling with me was one of astonishment to find myself so completely at home, so entirely without a sense of being amongst foreigners. I began to think that either I must be a Hungarian without knowing it, or else I must have got lost amongst a tribe of Englishmen." So here's Gordon. There's Gordon, went in 1879. Gordon was minister in Belfast at that time. Andrew Chalmers went at the same time. Andrew Chalmers was at that point minister in Cambridge. He later became quite a distinguished minister in Yorkshire, in Wakefield. Gordon went and produced a report for the British and Foreign Unitarian Association, which is probably still the most useful account, if you can find it, of the life, in English, of the life of the church in Transylvania in 1879. Because Gordon was very perceptive. He sort of made an attempt to learn Hungarian before he went, and he wrote a very detailed account of the life of the church. Chalmers wrote a longer account, which was published in 1880, published as was a piece of travel literature. It was reprinted in 2011 by the British Library. You have to say rather badly reprinted, but it has still in print. You can get it. Very interesting to read it. And at the time, Chalmers and Gordon didn't travel together. Chalmers went as far as Budapest and then travelled down the Danube. Gordon went by train all the way. And Alexander Gordon was a very determined traveller. He travelled a lot, and he made his journey of great use to him as a historian. He stopped off at Krakow on the way and investigated Unitarian materials there, and he stopped off at Luklevice as well, and again went to all the libraries and wrote back letters and did a lot of work there. But Gordon and Chalmers met up eventually in Koloshvar in Cluj, and because we're accustomed to seeing Michael Portillo traversing the continent by train, and it's really the train that enables people to get there. But it wasn't, even then, it wasn't that easy. And Gordon says of Bradshaw, he says, Bradshaw's Continental, that's the train guidebook, is perhaps the worst railway guide ever huddled together for the misinformation of unfortunate travellers. So Gordon never minced his words, when needed. So, but he got there. He knew what he was doing. Alexander Gordon was minister in Belfast, so he took an official message from the British and Foreign Unitarian Association. He also took 3 messages from the churches in Ireland, because at the time they weren't all speaking to each other, but they all wanted to send messages. So he brought 3 messages from Ireland, 2 of them in Latin and 1 in English, all of which had to be replied to. But again, Chalmers' advantage was he could speak fluent German. And a lot of the communication at this time was in German. And Chalmers is usually described as the first Englishman to preach in Transylvania, in a Unitarian church in Transylvania. He says this himself, but he was in fact Scottish. But he preached in Collishfar in 1879. Just before we start looking at the slides proper, I might mention again John Paget, who mentioned before. He established his estate at a place called Geresh, which was run like an English country house. And although all these visitors were always full of praise for their Hungarian hosts, you can sense their own sense of relief when they get to Geresh and go to stay in John Paget's English country house. So Lucy Taggart remembered, the greatest contrast presented itself between the refined house, the varied cultured talk, the wide dusty streets, and the almost savage-looking population of various races. And when she arrived in 1858, the house was still being restored after being sacked in 1848. He was sent into exile for 5 or 6 years. And J.A. Steinthal said, "Here I spent some delightful days surrounded by comforts to which for some time I had been a stranger." And J.J. Taylor said, "I cannot indeed too strongly express my grateful sense of the considerate kindness and generous hospitality of these excellent people. Without them, under a climate so peculiar and amidst manners so different from our own, our visit to Transylvania might have been far less agreeable and satisfactory than it was." So they were all glad to get to see John Paget and his place. And his estate continued on into the 20th century until after the First World War, when it was broken up after Transylvania was incorporated into Romania. So again, we see these phases in Transylvanian life of prosperity and democracy and progress, and then repression and suffering. Right. Just before we look at the slides, I've tried to list, and these are all, I think, mostly taken from Professor Shandor Kovac's short history of the Transylvanian Church. I've tried to list some of the difficulties that existed in Transylvania, particularly, well, not only, but certainly for Unitarians over the 450 years since because the Edict of Torda was this declaration of toleration. It respected and recognized 4 religions, namely the Catholic religion, the Reformed Church, the Lutheran Church, and the Unitarian Church. And this is in 1568. This is pre-Enlightenment. This is just 51 years after Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg. So it's a very early expression of toleration. And before he died, Philip Hewitt pointed out that he wasn't the first. The first was in Poland, and the minor Reformed church there was part of an opening up of toleration there. The thing about the situation in Poland was it was utterly destroyed. We're hearing this morning from Dr. Razor's excellent lecture, the quote from Martin Luther King and from Theodore Parker before that about the arc of the universe bends towards justice. Well, often it does, but it doesn't always. And I think Raymond Holt used to say of the minor Reformed church in Poland that it was an example that good doesn't always triumph, because it was destroyed utterly. It was stamped out. We might say little portions of it transferred to Transylvania and elsewhere, but basically it was destroyed. But here's just a list of some of the obstacles that came up following this edict of toleration. You can read them there. There's a whole series of problems. 1603, I think that should be 1595. But there are periods where the Counter-Reformation becomes very strong in Transylvania. And then because of the sort of borderland situation of Transylvania, sometimes that fades away. So that's why it doesn't go the same way as in Poland. But you can see different things happening. Ultimately, a lot of property seized at different times, on into the end of the 18th century and into the 19th and 20th century. And of course, the big change for Hungarians comes in 1918 at the end of the First World War, when at the Treaty of Trianon, Transylvania is ceded to Romania. And my churches in Northern Ireland, they have a sister church, a sister congregation in rural Transylvania. And they probably had more, from what I can tell, they had more property seized by the government in 1918 than they did under the communists. And whilst most of the property taken in the communist period has been returned, most of the property from 1918 hasn't been returned. So, as we see there, 63.6% of church property seized by the government after 1918. And of course, in recent times, this kind of problem has continued with many people remember the program of Ceausescu, who planned to bulldoze all the villages and to move all the people into tower blocks in urban areas. And this was partly motivated by a desire to crush the culture of the Hungarian minority. And at the time, Austin Fitzpatrick and others did lots to try and help the churches in Transylvania. So here we start. This is a famous picture of the Diet of Torda. In the middle there, this is Francis David, the leader of the Unitarians in Transylvania. Over here is King John Sigismund in the red. Behind him, I think this one here is meant to be Biandrata, who was the physician to John Sigismund's mother, Queen Isabella, and helped to start Unitarianism in Transylvania, but later became the persecutor of Francis David. But this is a very famous late 19th century picture. It's reproduced in many places. It's now in the museum in Torda, and it's meant to show the Diet, the Parliament, inside the Catholic Church in the town of Torda. And here is the edict, the religious part of the edict, written originally in Hungarian, and on the right you can see the key passage which talks of tolerance. Ministers should everywhere preach and proclaim the gospel according to their understanding of it, and if their community is willing to accept this, good. If not, however, no one should be compelled by force if their spirit is not at peace, but a minister retained whose teaching is pleasing to the community. No one is permitted to threaten or imprison or banish anyone because of their teaching, because faith is a gift of God. So again, a very startling decision for 1568. There are various translations, but they'll basically give the same intent. And here is a picture of the edict itself. We were shown this by a member of the National Archives, who on a Sunday afternoon opened the archives up for us and took the edict out for us to see. Rarely seen document. It's actually bound with all the other annual edicts. On the right is the 1569 page, but on the left is the last page of 1568. And here's a close-up at the top. If your 16th century Hungarian is up to speed, you'll be able to see exactly what that says. But as I say, there were 4 religions recognized: Catholic, Reformed, Lutheran, Unitarian. The Greek Orthodox, which in fact comprised the majority population, wasn't recognized. There were 3 copies of the edict made, one for each of the so-called nations who made up the Transylvanian nation, namely the Hungarians, the Settlers, and the Saxons. This is the only one that survived. This copy was in the possession of the Saxons, and it's now kept in Sibiu, which was known in German as Hermannstadt, and was the main location for the Saxon population, most of whom under the communist era and since the fall of the Berlin Wall have emigrated one way or another to Germany. And there's a picture of us all gathering around to photograph this rarely seen document. Now, this is Torda itself. I'm sure many people have been there. This is the Catholic Church in Torda. And on the 13th of January, the exact anniversary of the promulgation of the edict, a big service there. Not just there, it was relayed to the Unitarian Church and to the Reformed Church in the town and to the town square as well. And anyone who stood in the town square to watch the big screen was very hardy because it was about -5 at the start of the day. But the Catholic Church at the time was the Unitarian Church. At the time of the Counter-Reformation, the Unitarians were ejected and built their own church, which is still there. But it was a very, very ecumenical occasion, and one, I think, of special interest to all the Hungarian faiths. So I think, although it's an important Unitarian event, it's seen as important within the Hungarian culture. But having said that, everybody was fully represented, so much so that there were 16 speakers, which made for quite a long afternoon, a long morning. But it was everything was simultaneously translated. And so there were speakers from the Roman Catholic Church, from the Reformed Church, from the Lutheran Church, from the Unitarian Church, also from the Greek Orthodox Church, and also from the Greek Catholic Church. The Greek Catholic Church is a small sort of offshoot from the Orthodox Church, which was created in Habsburg times, which, although it is orthodox in terms of its liturgy and in worship, owes its allegiance to the Pope. And they too in the past have had some degree of persecution. But it was a splendid occasion, a very interesting occasion. There's the 2 ministers who introduced all the speakers, wearing traditional Hungarian costume. It was also broadcast live on 2 Hungarian television stations, and there was big news all over that part of Europe. Obviously, Unitarians were interested. I know lots of people have spoken about it, but it's something we know wasn't mentioned in the news here. But it was a big deal in Transylvania, Romania, Hungary, and so on. Amongst the speakers, there were also some political representatives. So a fellow called Victor Apache, who was the Romanian State Secretary for Churches, spoke. A number of local political Hungarian representatives spoke. And I suppose the main speech was given by Laszlo Kova, President of the Hungarian Parliament. And it's very interesting, it's very parallel to some things you see in Northern Ireland, where there would be services or religious events or indeed political events in churches where you would have representatives of different states, and there'd be all sorts of questions of which country you're in, kind of thing. And something similar there. It was a very Hungarian occasion. As I say, there's a representative of the Romanian government, but Laszlo Kova was one of the founder members of Fidesz, which which is the party in power in Hungary, and is a party really a sort of conservative nationalist kind of party. So there are lots of undercurrents going on there. Also, just a couple of days before this event, no less a person, the Prime Minister of Romania, made a comment to the effect that if the settlers, that is some of the Hungarians, wanted to fly the settler flag, they should fly next to the flag. They should hang next to the flag. And this is obviously quite an intemperate remark. And it was mentioned by some of the speakers in the church. As a consequence, I think the mayor of Torda, who's Romanian, didn't attend this event. But a long service inside. Outside, we went for the unveiling of the new monument here. So we all gathered outside. There were another 3 or 4 speeches here. You can see everybody lined up to see the monument. A number of speakers. Many people here will know the Reverend David Gero and the Reverend Joseph Casoni, both visited here a number of times and visited our colleges and so on. And David gave the address, which will be published in a future issue of Faith and Freedom, and Joseph gave the blessing at the end. Some of the dignitaries, again, you can see the different churches all represented with the Unitarian bishop here and the Roman Catholic Archbishop here. And the start of the unveiling of the memorial. This is the bishop on this side behind the camera, and this is the Speaker of the Parliament here. And this gentleman is Zoltán Balog, who is the Hungarian Minister of Human Resources. Former Calvinist minister, actually. I think he has a reputation not akin to, not unlike Boris Johnson or something like that, but he also spoke. Now, the memorial itself, you see it here, is a very impressive structure, a very impressive piece of art. And I think we've got to remember that this is a Unitarian memorial commemorating a mainly Unitarian event, but it's been erected on the property of the Catholic Church. So, you know, there's a degree of ecumenical acceptance there that wouldn't necessarily happen in Britain, I think. But it's by a Romanian artist called Liviu Mocan, called Ad Astra. And you can see it's made up of, it's obviously echoes of Jacob's ladder, but it's made up of steps, which gradually turn into books, and the books turn into doves. So it's quite an effective piece of art. And the bottom there it rests on a stone which echoes the boulder, which we'll see later, on which Francis David is said to have stood when he converted the city of Kolozsvár to Unitarianism. But it's a nice piece of art. I suppose you should say health and safety nightmare. I don't know. But there you go. It looks good. And there's at the base is inscribed in English, German, Romanian, and Hungarian, no one shall be reviled for his religion by anyone, for faith is the gift of God. Right, so that is erected there in the town of Torda, next to the Catholic Church. Torda is the place where toleration is first enunciated in Transylvania in 1568. But the Unitarian story really starts here in Gyulafejevar, as it's called in Hungarian, or Alba Iulia in Romanian, and Carlsberg in German. And a lot of places in Transylvania and really throughout Eastern Europe, throughout Central Europe, a lot of places have 2, 3, 4 names. And this is part of the history of an area which is defined by multicultural background, quite unlike what we would generally be used to in Britain. But this is the Roman Catholic Cathedral, and this is the Orthodox Cathedral. The Roman Catholic Cathedral dates back to the 15th century. The Orthodox Cathedral is 20th century. You can see here is an engraving from the mid-19th century. So the Orthodox cathedral is placed very close to the Catholic cathedral. It's called the Orthodox one is called the Cathedral of the Coronation, and it's used for crowning the kings of Romania in the 20th century. And this was the centre of royal power in Transylvania from the 16th century onwards, as we'll see. But one of the sort of products of the incorporation of Transylvania into Romania has been that the state, both pre-war and even in the communist era and since the communist era, they've used the Romanian Orthodox Church as a way of Romanianizing Transylvania. So there's a lot of state resources go into building Orthodox churches and cathedrals, and this one was built a long time ago. It's quite an impressive building, but it's basically, they're usually concrete blocks with stone cladding. But it's an impressive building, but deliberately built right next to the Catholic cathedral and deliberately built bigger. Well, it was very important. This place was also very important. You can see the cannon at the front there. It was a very important military base for the Habsburgs. So inside the cathedral there, and this is what Gordon says about it. And Alexander Gordon, you can usually rely on him and his opinions. Whoever wants to see the great architectural reminder of Transylvania of the palmy days of the Unitarian Church must travel away from College Far to the noble semi-Byzantine Cathedral of St. Michael at Gyulafejevar. And there are the tombs of the only Unitarian royal personages in existence. So it's a very impressive place. We arrived and the Archbishop showed us round. He welcomed us as pilgrims, which was really nice. He spent a lot of time explaining the cathedral and its history and so on, and very patiently showed us all the way around. Again, it was a very cold day, but it was very, very interesting. So that's outside in the courtyard. Here are the royal tombs. You can see John II Sigismund and some details, and his mother, Queen Isabella's tomb. And so that is the tomb of the only Unitarian king in history. Both tombs were defaced during an invasion from, well, you could say a Mongol invasion at some point. They smashed the faces off, but mostly still there. Now, this cathedral, as Alexander Gordon says, was used for Unitarian worship, and this is the only piece of furniture that remains from those days. The Archbishop was very keen to give us a very full guided tour, very interesting tour, and he was very keen to show off the different aspects. This choir stall dates from the late 18th century, after Unitarian times, and he was pointing out all the different religious images. He set a sort of quiz to everyone to identify what the Bible story was. So you probably guessed that one. There's Jacob's ladder again. This is Elisha, right? Elisha goes out for a walk one morning, and a group of children abuse him. Well, they shout, "Go up, baldy head, go up." I'm afraid it's a bull, this story, but they shout, they call him names because he's bald, because he's follically challenged. Anyway, it doesn't end there, because Elisha then commands 2 she-bears to attack the children. And the bears take their revenge and rip them to pieces. But as I say, it does give the Old Testament a bad name. And I don't know, it doesn't do much good for the PR for bull people either. But but there we have it. But the Archbishop explained his exegesis of the story. I have to say I didn't get it, but you know. But if I've learned anything, I'll never insult a bold person. Now, there's another tomb that was of great interest in the cathedral. It's the tomb of Bishop Martin Aron. I don't know if you can all read that. But he was priest in College Far, and I think later bishop here. But he was the only church leader in the Nazi times to stand up to the Nazi persecution of the Jews. there were others who, I think it says, maybe wrote and complained, but he really did stick his neck out as the bishop, and he told the Nazi authorities that they would be judged by God, and did his best to stop the persecution of Jews, which obviously was a very serious event in the history of Transylvania. It's not widely known, I think, that in College Var there was a ghetto. There was one of the smaller ghettos, but it was a ghetto where 18,000 people were incarcerated in the brickworks in College Var before being carted off to Auschwitz. So it was a terrible era. And Martin Aron was one of he's now celebrated in the Righteous Amongst the Nations, Yad Vashem, and this is where this quotation comes from. All these people were deported to Auschwitz in 1944, and he was one of the few people to speak out against it. So when we think of religious toleration, this is the sort of thing really we have to think of. There's also a statue of him in the cathedral grounds. He died in 1980, I think, but there's a statue of him. He was bishop from the Nazi era through the communist era, and the communists placed him under house arrest. And he used to sit inside the cloisters, and the students for the priesthood would come and sit by him, and he would teach them and talk to them there. But quite an inspiring and impressive figure who the Catholic Church is moving towards canonizing. And in College Var there is a Holocaust Memorial, which was designed by one of the victims who came back. But that's a memorial to the more than 18,000 people who were placed in the College Var ghetto and deported to Auschwitz. Right. Well, we'll look at College Var now. This is what in the 19th century was known as the Inner Hungarian Street. If you've been there, you will know this road. And on the right there is the Unitarian College. And here is the main first Unitarian Church. And here is the Lutheran Church further along. But that's one of the main streets. And one of the things you notice from this picture is the profusion of Romanian flags hanging out in front of virtually every building, and it's the same throughout Cluj, throughout College Var. This year is also the centenary of the incorporation of Transylvania into Romania, and there is, particularly in areas where there are large Hungarian minorities, there is a lot of emphasis on being reminded of this. But you see, John James Taylor was there in 1869, and he calls it by its German name, Klausenberg. It's a clean, bright, cheerful-looking town with well-paved shops, cafes, and handsome houses. It's now, I think, the fastest-growing city in Romania, and it does have good shops, cafes, and handsome houses. There is the Catholic Church, St. Michael's Church, in the centre of College Var, and as S.A. Steinhold makes the point, it was the Unitarian Church for a long time. It was a Unitarian Church from the time of Francis David, from 1568 until 1716, part of the Counter-Reformation. Under the occupation of the Austrian army, the Unitarians were removed from this church and actually spent a long time without a church. They weren't allowed to build a new church, but this was originally the Unitarian Church in the town. That's the side entrance to the church, and what J.J. Taylor thought he could see St. George there, first of all, but it's not St. George. But it's a very, very impressive building, and interesting to think that it was once a Unitarian church. I should say, outside this church in 1940, northern Transylvania was given back by the Germans to Hungary, and Admiral Horthy, who was the Hungarian dictator virtually, greeted a military parade outside the church. The Hungarian army marched past to mark the reunification of northern Transylvania with Hungary, and it was a it was clearly, you can see film of this as a very popular event for most Hungarians at the time. This is inside the cathedral, or the church, not actually a cathedral. A very impressive building. And there's a view of some pillars. And if you look at the pillars, you see these empty niches. And of course, once upon a time, in medieval times, statues of saints would have stood there. And we should remember that people who pulled down those statues were, of course, Unitarians, who didn't approve of things like that. And also the murals, which were similarly defaced by eager Unitarians in the late 16th century. Just another couple of views, the not at all over the top pulpit and looking back towards the organ. Now this church is right in the centre of Kolozsvár, Cluj. It is the Franciscan Church. Next to it is a monastery. And this building here is the start of the monastery. Now Arthur Long used to say that there were only two places in the world where there was a Unitarian college. Now with the sad intended closure of the Unitarian College in Manchester, this means that there'll only be one Unitarian college in the world, and it's here in Kolozsvár. But this building here, this monastery, was the original location of the original Unitarian College. You can see some mentions here, including a comment by Alexander Gordon. And it was really reading Gordon that made me realize that this building was the original Unitarian College. It's right next door to the Franciscan Church, which again was Unitarian. There's another view of it there. It was brief after the Reformation. It was briefly a royal residence. It was the main school in Kolozsvár where Francis David was educated, where he became the headmaster. And subsequently, this building was the original building in which the Unitarian College was housed in the late 16th century. We can see inside. Here is the refectory. There'd been some kind of children's party in there, which is why the balloons are there. But there's the pulpit there, and this was the monks' refectory, and presumably either used for teaching in the 16th century or still used as a refectory. That's the view the other way across that room. And there's the pulpit, and with some graffiti there dating 50. This will be Unitarian graffiti. You can see by the date. And the stairs. So to me, it was very exciting to go into this building, which is another example of the way property was seized and not given back. So, well, it was seized by the Protestants and ultimately by the Unitarians in the 16th century. In the I think the late 17th century, it was given back to the Franciscans. After the communist takeover after the war, it was seized by the government, and only in recent years has been returned to the Franciscan owners. So the whole history of Transylvania is stories of confiscation and so on. And it's now back in the hands, and for the first time it's starting to be restored, and people are beginning to appreciate its history. That's the entrance area. Right, so 1693, the Unitarians are forced out of this building, but they have another medieval building where the Unitarian College moves to. And we're back by, it's only again through Alexander Gordon that I realized this. The next door to St. Michael's Church in the centre is what Gordon calls the plebania, which I think is Polish for clergy house. And by chance I took a picture of this door, and you can see closer, there is a list of, you might be able to read it, it says Roman Catholic plebania. It's the church house, the parochial house. It's a very large, long, originally medieval building, but this was the second home of the Unitarian College, where they stayed until 1718, when again another round of ejections following counter-Reformation activity pushed them out of this place. So there's the college. What was the college there? Runs along the side of the church, and again, it's something that's been restored to its original owners only recently. So it's now back in the hands of the Catholic Church in its entirety. And they opened, put this, you can see how the thickness of the walls shows the age of it. They opened a cafe in here, which is a very nice, pleasant cafe. And gradually, property has been returned to the original owners. But this was the second home of the Unitarian College in Koloshvar. Now, the third one is demolished now, but this is the current home of the Unitarian College, and also the headquarters, and also the site of a number of schools. Very good secondary school. This building was opened in 1901, and was a very, very modern building at the time. It was very local architect, but built to sort of specifications that thought of everything, and with everything, with a swimming pool in the cellar and all sorts of things. So, very impressive building, and still the headquarters and the Unitarian College today. Next door is the church, which dates from 1796, which many people will have been in. And it's noted by all the visitors from Britain. It is a very impressive building, and its design was used in churches all over Transylvania after that. For a long period in the 18th century, the situation was such that the Unitarians couldn't build new churches, and there's a long period of 70 or 80 years where the people in Koloshvar had to worship in homes or whatever place they could find. But at the end of the century, there's a sort of re-emergence of tolerance, and they built this very impressive large church. That's just to show the tower at the top there. You can see it has a very, very distinctive sort of Baroque tower. This only dates from about 1908. The original tower, you can see, was like that. And the architect of this building put the new top on. This slide is a glass lantern slide from a party of visitors who went in 1901. And I'm very pleased to have this, probably a partial collection of slides which shows what visitors saw in 1901, which eventually I hope to digitize. Inside the church, Alexander Gordon was very impressed with it. J.J. Taylor, not so much. But it is a very, very impressive building. I know of no Unitarian church in which the sense of space is so grandly given, and the pure white tint which reigns everywhere adds the impressions of majestic simplicity. Yeah, and Andrew Chalmers as well. And at the occasion of the 13th of January, the day before, there was a big concert in the church here. It was packed again, a very ecumenical occasion, and they premiered a new piece by Alan Williams, who of course not only a British composer but a British Unitarian composer, and a piece for string quartet was played there, and he was able to introduce his piece in fluent Hungarian, which I think was greatly appreciated by everybody. And I'm sure many people have been in the foyer in the vestibule of the church, and there's the boulder there, which was said to be the boulder on which Francis David stood to convert the populace in 1568. He came back from the Edict of Torda, stood on the boulder, and according to the story, converted the whole city. Also a memorial to a Polish pastor, because what was left of the church in Poland found sanctuary in the end in Koloshvar, and they erected their own Polish-speaking Unitarian church, which lasted, meeting in its own place, speaking Polish, until towards the end of the 18th century. And eventually that was closed, and they sold the building to help pay for this new Unitarian church in 1796. Now, one of the things people asked me, said, could I say something about what the relevance of the Edict of Torda is to modern British Unitarians? Well, I think on one level, it's part of our shared European history. It's part of the history of the Transylvanian Unitarians, and we need to acknowledge that and to rejoice in it too. It is a pioneering milestone in the development of religious liberty, much earlier than most other expressions of this. And we should celebrate that. It's part of the story of our Transylvanian sisters and brothers. And that's a story which has been characterized much more by persecution and dispossession and government interference and so on. But throughout all that persecution, they have really against the odds, I would say, managed to survive. But without this initial expression of tolerance of which they were a part, they probably never would have done. Now, it's interesting to see how the edict is being used by modern Hungarian Unitarians. So following the celebrations, they've taken their case to the Hungarian and the Romanian parliaments, and also to the European Parliament. And you know, it's kind of interesting at this point where we were thinking about Brexit this morning, and you know, we perhaps think about Brexit a lot, but here we are about to exit from the European Union, and yet it's very important for people in Transylvania. And they had some major conferences at the European Parliament in Brussels, and one of the speakers here is Laszlo Tokes, who you might remember was a reform minister who was one of the leaders of the revolution in Transylvania in 1989, a very inspiring figure. But they went there to try and encourage the European Parliament to recognize the 13th of January as Religious Freedom Day, and to make religious freedom something of import to the political classes in Europe. So that's Brussels, and this is Strasbourg, I think. That's Istvan Kovac, and people remember Istvan from when he was in Britain. He's now the public affairs director of the church, and he's presenting the vice president of the European Parliament with a petition to make religious freedom a key value, and also a day marked every year. And I think the Hungarian Parliament has actually approved this idea already. And in the Hungarian Parliament, they had a big meeting there. There's the bishop addressing a massive gathering in, I think, the upper house of the Parliament in Budapest. So those are some of the. This is some indication of how important this edict is to our co-religionists in Transylvania, and they've invested a lot of time and effort and money in trying to project this into the places where elected representatives meet. And they've also done a lot themselves to try and project their message. So the former bishop's house in Kolozsvár in Cluj is being converted into a centre for the study of religious freedom, and they are translating their works into Romanian to try and reach out to the Romanian population around them. But that's just my impression. That's what I saw. I've tried to give some indication of what previous visitors saw and made of it. But I'm glad to share it with you, and I hope in some ways it's been interesting.
My name is Anike Ferenci. I'm from Kolozsvár. I'm a seminary teacher. So I would like to thank you, your presentation. And it's the second time I'm a scholar here. I spent 3 wonderful months. And I would like to say a thanks that I can be here. And it was very useful. And this connection is just wonderful. So thank you being here. And thank you this opportunity.
Perfect way to finish, thank you. But I think, again, thank you so much, David, for that. It was an inspiring talk. It led to some fantastic discussion as well. So can you hands together again, please, for
Thank you.